I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors of the podcast, Sierra Pacific Windows, who, when they reached out to me recently, I was glad to say yes, because we at Building Culture use their windows on about 90% of our projects. The whole team loves them. And really thankful to have them sponsoring the podcast. I also want to thank One Source Windows, who, if you are in the state of Oklahoma, it doesn't just matter about the window manufacturer, but also about the distributor and the installer and the people you're working with. And we've used One Source Windows, who sells Sierra Pacific and several other great lines, for also about 90% of our projects. All right, on to the podcast.
Our sort of inclinations and animal instincts are being weaponized against us by these companies that are trying to make highly profitable, highly palatable, very addictive foodstuffs. Fixing the chronic disease crisis in the US, I think it is going to run through fixing our environment, our buildings, our food system, any number of these things, and make them health promoting rather than health detracting.
This week's guest is Justin Mayers. Over the past decade, Justin has founded 3 health brands, Kettle and Fire, Perfect Keto, and Surely non-alcoholic wine, which do tens of millions in revenue. You can find Kettle and Fire, really high-quality bone broth, taking up a big shelf in Whole Foods or Sprouts. He's a really impressive person, and I just love what he's doing and how he thinks. Today, you will learn about how profoundly broken our food and health systems are, which is fairly depressing. But at the same time, we have to recognize and articulate the problems before we can solve them. And there is a lot of hope because we have people like Justin working, and many others out there working on these big problems. And my goal today is to arm you with information. Actionable information. If you are wondering why I'm talking about food on a building podcast, it's because our mission at Building Culture is to facilitate human flourishing, specifically through the built environment. But human health is utterly essential to human flourishing. It's a prerequisite. It doesn't matter how beautiful the architecture, how perfectly arranged the buildings are, if we aren't healthy. And as you will see, we are very, very sick. I'll put resources in the show notes, but be sure to follow Justin's monthly Substack The Next, where he puts out some really helpful and actionable information. I'm always pulling new products and tips from him. Today, I'm posting part 2. You can go find part 1, last week's episode. My name is Austin Tennell, and this is the Building Culture Podcast. I complain about this all the time in building. We build so much disposable crap, and it's not just disposable, it's toxic to humans.
Yeah.
But, we build it disposably and it ends up in a landfill in 50, 60 years. But, then it just increases GDP because we got, but it's so much of it is in service of this kind of industrial machine, and it's not in service of human beings and human well-being. And I think like food systems and our built environment, really the core value should be, how do we help people flourish? How do we help people live the healthiest lives? We can't force it. You can't, force people to flourish. I can't build things and force people to flourish, but we can set the stage, give people the tools that they need. But there is a lot.
Yeah, no, look, I totally agree. I think that for basically most of human history, people's environment sort of constrained it was basically from many hundreds of thousands of years hard to give yourself, and basically impossible to give yourself a chronic disease by eating inappropriate foods. Like if you're a hunter gatherer, like if you wanted to get a chronic disease or something by eating like horrible foods for you over a period of time, it was basically impossible. Like your environment just wouldn't allow you to make that choice. And I think that there have been an amazing, an incredible number of things that are positive about modernity. I think that one of the downsides that has been lost is that, our environment sort of used to, by default, take care of this like human flourishing aspect, or at least didn't offer unlimited numbers of opportunities for making you sick, giving you chronic disease, giving you X, Y, or Z. I think today, basically, we have an environment where a lot of the institutions that surround us, in the case of like this space that I focus on a lot, food, big pharma, and our agriculture industry, all of these are sort of like the players within them are not looking at how do I build a food system that encourages human flourishing, but it's how do I build a food product that is maximally profitable to me over a lifetime of, consumers that are going to consume this. And if you think about, like Coca-Cola, for example, their best customer in a sense is not like a me or a you who probably doesn't drink the stuff, certainly doesn't drink it regularly. But it's someone that like gets addicted to Coca-Cola, drinks it multiple times a day, and kind of hangs on and does it for as long as they can stay alive, so that Coke makes extracts maximum profit from that human lifespan. And one of the big concerns that I have, and one of the things I've been thinking about lately, is there's not a single institution really that is aligned with human flourishing in a way that that institution has almost the imperative to protect and promote, you or I living our best, healthiest, most productive lives. Like at one point, maybe that was government. Certainly at one point that was probably like religion. But I think both of those institutions seem to be less powerful, or like not doing quite as good of a job maybe today as they once were. And so I think we're left to this situation where you have a food system where big food is making maximally addictive, maximally profitable, food-like products. And these big food companies are regulated by the regulators that have been completely captured by the big food companies, where, they're getting outspent like 11 to 1 for every, dollar of research the NIH spends on studying nutrition. Big food spends $11. It's just like, it's game over.
And they perform their own studies too.
Yeah, of course. Right. Yeah. I mean, or they fund universities that then create studies that say, oh no, like in something Coca-Cola's, I don't know how well known this is, but in like, I think it was like 2009 to 2015, they spent like $200 something million around studies that showed that, no, it's actually not what you eat that leads to chronic disease or obesity. It's you're not moving enough. And so they started something called the Global Energy Balance Network that says you just have to move more. It doesn't matter if you have a Coke. Like it's all about, you're not exercising enough. You're not expending enough calories. Like you're fat because it's your fault. It's not because of what you're eating or drinking. Like buy another Coke. And so I think that this is, this is like, that was like 9 years ago. This is just like the big food playbook. And I think that we today as a society don't necessarily have institutions or like a sense-making apparatus that allows us to respond to this level of like regulatory capture and, misalignment of incentives between you or I wanting to live a healthy life and the companies that are, putting addictive, cheap foodstuffs in front of us at every turn.
I don't mean I understand as in I condone, but like at least I can wrap my head around big food companies that are big corporations that, and I want to talk about this towards the end of, they're not really owned by anyone. I can understand them seeking to maximize profits and not really caring about the outcomes, even though I obviously don't agree with that in any way. But the one that really gets me is the healthcare industry itself and doctors and hospitals and stuff. Have you had much experience talking to doctors? What's your and if you have, like what's your kind of take on the state of that industry? And are people aware and they're just not saying anything because they're not allowed to, or because they're scared, or are they just not aware, or they just weren't trained right because of medical school? Like, what's your kind of take on, and I should say, there's so many doctors, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, because these people are very smart. They've worked hard. They've spent money to go to school. They know a bunch of stuff I don't know. And then some doctors that I've been to, just over the past decade of my life, I'm like, you know nothing.
Yeah.
They're literally going, I'm sitting, they're like, here's this pill, here's that pill. And there's people I regularly talk to, and they're like, oh, my doctor's got me on a new blood pressure medication, blah, blah. And of course, and I'm like, have they talked to you about anything? I mean, heck, I got some foot surgeries recently, and without saying any, when it still wasn't working, it was just like, oh, just shoot up with more cortisone. And I didn't even know it at the time, because I was like, I asked a lot of questions. Are there any downsides? Oh, no. You can do as much as you want. Well, then I went and talked to another doctor later and realized like, oh, you definitely don't want to do that. It's going to weaken your ligaments, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going, what's going on here?
Yeah. I think that healthcare, like for my money, like food, healthcare, housing, education are probably the four most broken industries in the US. I'm sure that other people with deep domain expertise probably in other spaces would probably argue theirs is the most. But
those are mine.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, if you look right now, I think that doctors realize that there's something like deeply wrong with the healthcare system. Like the like, I believe that job satisfaction among doctors is lower than it's ever been. I think it's possibly the lowest of like any major profession right now. Suicide rate among doctors is like higher than it's ever been in the last, decade or so. Like like you take those as snapshots, you take snapshots that a GP spends an average of like 7 minutes a year talking to one of their patients. And it's not hard to understand that these doctors they don't really build relationships with patients anymore. Their job is no longer, how do I take care of you, Austin, who is dealing with this foot thing? It is like a foot comes in that is attached to someone named Austin. And I, as a specialist who only look at foot things, I'm going to spend as little time as I possibly can on this to look at it and go, yep, this fits like my prior of X, Y, and Z things. I'm going to write this prescription, and then I'm going to go on with my day and do this as many times as I can to make sure I get paid. I think that what one thing that has happened at a very high level is that we've gone from a bunch of a profession of doctors, sort of generalists who could sit with a patient and understand, what is going on. They could understand trade-offs, lifestyle, like these things that may be impacting your health outcomes, to one of specialists where, specialists get paid the highest rates out of by insurers. They then get to look at very special cases where they get paid more for their specialization. And that sort of runs up the cost of healthcare and also ensures that, a specialist in ankle X, Y, or Z things that are happening is just going to see a slew of ankles connected to people, as opposed to a doctor that might actually be like, oh, I have this decade-long relationship with Austin and have a better sense of what may be going on or what he might need from a care standpoint. And I think that the model sort of our healthcare system is very broken. And I think that if I had to like pick a fundamental thing that I think is wrong with our healthcare system, is we built a healthcare system where the default assumption, and it was true, post World War II, is that the average person is healthy. Occasionally someone will get sick. And it's our job as a medical profession or as our healthcare industry to bring them back to health. The opposite is true now. Like, the average person is sick today. 85% of all care, all costs goes towards managing chronic conditions, not even curing them, not even doing anything like that. And there is no such thing as taking, a healthy patient that is sick and then we boot them back into like the healthy population where they're no longer involved in the healthcare system. I just think that we have this model of acute care that we're trying to stretch into the management of chronic disease and, into like overseeing, managing, and controlling like all aspects of a patient's life that is suffering with chronic disease. And I just think that the same model does not work. Something I think about a lot is there was a saying of like, health isn't found in a doctor's office. And I think that's true. Like, we again, as I was saying earlier, I don't think that fixing the chronic disease crisis in the US, I don't think that solution is going to run through a doctor's office. I think it is going to run through fixing our environment, our buildings, our food system, any number of these things, and make them health promoting rather than, making them health detracting.
Man, yeah, it's a big problem. And, even some of the reasons you're talking about, the hyper specialization, you see that across industries too. It's not just food. I talk about that a lot. That's why it's funny to talk to you and just read what you're doing. I'm like, man, there's so many parallels to just building and the reasons it's broken down. And, architect, the term architect, I mean, that's really a new profession, in the past 100 years. Like, there used to be, essentially master builders. It wasn't this license thing. And yeah, they knew design, they knew engineering, they knew how to build things. And there might be some more experts within that. But, now we've got architects, they're trained in the arts department of universities and, and not, and most universities not trained very well, I would also say. And then the engineers are in the science department and the construction managers are in the business department and the developers in the business department, the trades, didn't go to school or whatever. And then no one knows anything about each other's jobs or how to actually produce something. And it's just kind of like, let me just put my blinders on and do what I'm told. And of course, the same with the regulatory bodies and cities and zoning and the fire departments and the sewer departments and the planning departments. They just kind of have this, here's what my job is, to check this box, fill this out. And then once again, no one's actually got a coherent vision of what are we trying to accomplish. But
super interesting.
What strikes me is, in the food industry, and particularly in the healthcare industry, as so many of these really terrible outcomes really manifest, and it's becoming just inarguable when you just look at straight statistics, like just how terrible health outcomes in the United States are. I mean, it is horrible. Yet it's almost like instead of dealing with that or actually starting to address it, people are trying to like double down and prevent people from talking about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And not to be political about it. I don't mean it political in a Democrat Republican way. I just mean COVID was a really big kind of like wake up call for me, because when it was things are going, that's happening and unfolding, and I in Oklahoma, and I'm like, oh, I'm not going to get the vaccine. Like, I don't need it. I'm young. I'm healthy. All that kind of stuff. And then. But it was just kind of that thinking, like, oh, I'm not going to do it. We're doing, and then it was started to be like force, and people started trying to force you to do it. And I had to go to New York City during COVID, and that just felt like I was a criminal.
Yeah,
not being vaccinated. And I'm not trying to make a statement about whether people are vaccinated or not, but it was like I've come into that like when the force started trying to be applied. I was like, hold on a second, what's going on here, and why? And when I look at the health outcomes and what the FDA and the food system pyramid and all that like have been throughout my lifetime, I'm kind of like, why would I trust that? And then I just get told like, trust the experts. How dare you not trust the science? How dare you not trust the experts? Who are you? And I'm kind of going like, I don't know how, have you experienced any of that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that if by almost any metric you look at like how, what are measures of Americans' trust in traditional institutions, and they seem to be all at all-time low, like government, media, whatever, trust in these institutions are at historic lows. I think this is a big reason why, is because I can't tell you like how often I think about this idea that the default outcome, like you just have to look at the rest of the country right now and you go, if I don't want the default outcome, which is that 80% of people are overweight or obese, going to deal with one or more chronic diseases, like from a health standpoint, I definitionally have to do something different to avoid the average outcome, which is one that I don't want. You know what I mean? Like if I follow exactly the science or whatever the like institutions that are creating the dietary guidelines and like these sorts of things are saying, I'm going to achieve the default outcomes, and the default outcomes are bad. They're fucking bad. And like why you would follow this advice to achieve a default outcome or be pressured to follow this advice to achieve the default outcome, which is abysmal, is like crazy to me. I think of this, I kind of think of this like sometimes with like I think the vaccine stuff is like a decent example. I also saw this a lot with Perfect Keto, where when keto was becoming a trend that was growing quite a lot, like we were very early to the trend, we saw so many news articles that were like, why keto is dangerous, why keto is bad for you and all this sort of stuff. And to me, I'm like, keto is literally like trying to eat fewer carbohydrates and sugars. Like if you stopped eating carbs and sugar for 30 days and decided that you didn't like that and wanted to go back to your normal way of eating, it is impossible for me to believe that you would have any long-term negative ramifications or repercussions from cutting out carbs and sugar in your life for 30 days and then deciding maybe this keto thing isn't for me. Like the downside of trying keto is so insanely low that to see articles about this stuff, to see like, doctors going on CNN talking about a keto diet and like why it's bad for people and how it's dangerous, just was so preposterous to me. It sort of made me be like, yeah, this is why I don't believe, or why I don't think a lot of the sense-making institutions when it comes to health advice are worth following.
Seriously. And that this is a good segue into your take on veganism and vegetarianism, because the same doctors that are like, keto's dangerous, we need to get rid of all meat, which has become a cultural, like kind of this, once again, kind of this tyrannical thing coming from regulatory bodies and the government.
It's all Bill Gates stuff too. Bill Gates, and he's like funding all this stuff. It's so crazy.
And owns a bunch of farmland too, I understand, right?
I know. I don't understand that dude at all. I wish I could talk to him.
Yeah, it's interesting. You wouldn't expect a guy like that, like to, yeah, he's had a lot of
dude, just every time I see some like hugely like technological like intervention that will have massive long-term repercussions, Bill Gates is funding it. It's like, oh, I read a thing about like someone shooting sulfur into the atmosphere to blot out the sun to
I
prevent
saw
carbon
that.
change. And you're like, oh, of course, Bill Gates is
That
funding
sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, right. Like all the fake meat stuff, Bill Gates is funny. You're just like, I don't understand this guy's like worldview at all.
Seriously. Do you think you can be healthy eating a vegan or vegetarian diet, like in your personal opinion?
I
Do you
think
know?
I think maybe for periods of time. I think that certainly if you're like intense about it, probably. I think some people can do better than others, but I think that the default, like you have to look at again, most cultures throughout time have incorporated animal products in some way, shape, or form. We definitively know that if you don't feed a child animal products as they are being born and raised, it has huge health impacts. We know that there's a whole slew of health complications that come from being vegan or vegetarian over a long period of time. And so I think you can mitigate those. I don't necessarily think it's like a path towards optimal health. It's not something that I would recommend, but honestly, for me, if your choices, I think it depends on your choice. Like if your choice is an average American diet or a standard American diet where you're getting 50% of your calories from, ultra processed foods or going vegan, I think probably a vegan diet is healthier for you. If you're literally starting from square one and you're going, I'm going to change my diet regardless, and you're sort of looking at like paleo versus keto versus, vegan or vegetarian, I think that it would be kind of crazy to do a vegetarian or vegan diet that you plan to be on for the rest of your life. But, I'm open to being wrong on that. I don't think I am, but I'm like open to that.
Right. No, it's interesting that, it's hard to do studies because, you see so many studies of like, meat's bad for you, meat's bad for you. And you're like, what kind of meat are you eating? Because wildly, just look at the price, like free range, organic chicken breast, you're what, $10 a pound or something. It saves you somewhere like Whole Foods, so not even say like direct from farm or something. And then you can go to Walmart or just another grocery store and get the same quote unquote chicken breast, for $2 a pound. And you're going, okay, something's got to be going on with the different types of meat or beef, once again, the corn fed versus grass fed, and, the type of meat and all that seems to be really, really important.
Oh yeah. And like most of the studies that vegans and vegetarians point to support their sort of, worldview are ones where they're not breaking out the types of meat. Like they're basically just saying meat eaters versus non-meat eaters. And in the meat eating category, they count people, like I read one study and it was like counting people that ate like, they incorporated processed meats. And I was like, what are processed meats? It was basically like corn dogs, like just stuff that you're like, I would never, like, of course, a vegetarian who is being intentional about their food is going to be healthier on this population study than like a population of corn dog eaters. Like, I will never die on that hill saying that is healthier than eating vegan. You know what I mean? Just the way that we've done these studies is just so bad. It's almost hilarious.
I'd like to take 1 minute to talk about our sponsors a little bit more. Sierra Pacific Windows. So I mentioned that we use them at Building Culture in about 90% of our projects. And one of the main products we use from them is their H3 casement window. And their H3 is an aluminum clad window. We love casements that actually kind of open up rather than double hung that slide up and down, because you really get the whole window that opens up. And what I love about the H3 is that they're aluminum clad, but they're a great price. And comparable brands at that price point that are also aluminum clad, yeah, a lot of people make good windows, but what sets Sierra Pacific apart in my mind is the range of options. And I think they've got something like 27 colors, and they just released some more in that price point. They've got all sorts of different profiles we use, and we always use the 5/8 or almost always use the 5/8 putty profile. In other window manufacturers, you have to jump up to the more expensive models and spend double on the windows to get those same options. So that is one of the reasons that we love Sierra Pacific Windows. I also want to thank One Source Windows. So it doesn't just matter the window manufacturer. It matters who you buy your windows from, the distributor, because they're the ones that put together the package with you, walk you through all the details. You're basically building all these custom windows from scratch, and there's a lot of work that goes into that. They're also the ones installing it. They're also the ones warranting it, the people you're going to call if something's going wrong. And so having someone that you trust is really important. especially around windows, which are one of the most expensive components that go into a house. And like I said, we've used one source for about 90% of our projects in Oklahoma. So or if you are in the state of Oklahoma, I highly recommend you check out One Source Windows, who also sells Sierra Pacific. And you can go to onesourcewindows.com. And I forgot to mention, but Sierra Pacific, you can go to sierrapacificwindows.com. Thanks. This seems to be something that's growing, or like, because I follow a lot of functional medicine doctors and stuff, like true MDs and doctors and stuff like, and non-doctors as well. I follow, but a growing consensus I see among functional medicine doctors is that even with the perfectly healthy diet, so say it's all grass-fed meat and whatever, and in great balance and all that, they're saying, and their kind of like fundamental base philosophy is we can eat everything we need to be healthy. And they're coming out and starting to say, you know what? After 20 years doing this, I've started to change my mind because our food has so much fewer nutrients compared to just 50, 60 years ago that you kind of have to supplement as well in addition, because, and I can't remember statistics on, say, apples or broccoli or stuff, but like the amount of nutrients in a 2024 apple is completely different than what was in an apple in 1920 or some broccoli in 1920. Have you done much reading or research in that area about nutrient densities in foods and the declining, which my understanding is largely because of the use of pesticides and fertilizers and stuff in the way we do our monoculture crops? And
yeah, definitely. So the research that I have done does seem to point towards, I think there's two things that are driving like nutrient deficiency in our food. The one is sort of exactly what you're saying. Like we basically went from a model. Maybe like, let me back up. Like if you think about it, like where do nutrients come from? Like if a crop is nutrient dense, what does that mean? You can think about, for a crop to be nutrient dense, it must be pulling those nutrients from somewhere. That generally means the soil. And over a longer period of time, like you can imagine a tomato or something like that, it is like pulling more and more nutrients into the plant. If the soil has a lot of nutrients to give the plant, then that tomato will be more nutrient dense. And if that tomato has a longer time on the vine to sort of like pull nutrients out of the soil into it, it'll be much more nutrient dense. It's, interestingly, like nutrients also are experienced by humans as flavor. So when you eat something that is like super nutrient dense or something like that, it's also hugely more flavorful. This is why like a massive apple or something at Costco, that's non-organic, conventional, whatever, often like tastes a tenth as flavorful as like an apple that you could pick off a tree in like some orchard or something. I don't know if you ever had that experience, but it's a very, very interesting one. So all that to say, like as our farmland and as our soil has become depleted, as the nutrients that are inherent in the soil become depleted, we've had to respond by applying much more fertilizer, which is, sort of has like nutrient-like things, help crops grow faster and the like. As that's happened, soil gets less nutrient dense. We make up for that lack of nutrient density by over applying fertilizer. Fertilizer helps crops grow faster. You're basically sort of making the crops that we're growing less nutrient dense because one, they're pulling from soils that have fewer nutrients in them. And then secondly, the crops themselves are actually growing faster. And so they have less time to sort of like pull nutrients into them. By many measures, that means that, many crops in the US food system are looking at like 30 to 40% fewer nutrients relative to the crops of like the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So that I think is part one. The second part that I think is also interesting and confusing is if you look at, there's something called like the nutrient decay curve, which is basically you pick like a leaf of spinach or something like that. If you measure the amount of nutrient density and active nutrients in spinach the moment you pick it relative to like 72 hours later, the number of nutrients that you will have in like that leaf of spinach is like 80 to 90% higher at the moment of picking than it is after like a 72 hours.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I've never heard of that nutrient density curve.
Yeah, I wrote about this like maybe a year ago. I could send it to you if you want. But
yeah, please do. That's wild. I'll put it in the show notes too.
Yeah, so it's pretty insane. And so if like, to me, one of the concerning things I think is we right now we have this very, very centralized food system, where food is like grown, harvested, processed, packaged, and then shipped all over. And the time from picking to like ending up in a consumer's mouth is like oftentimes, weeks, in some cases, months. And if you look at something like spinach, where you're like, okay, this thing is grown on nutrient depleted soils, that is, that's less nutritious than it was 50 years ago. And I'm eating this 15 days after it's been harvested. Like, you're getting something that is maybe like single digit percentage points as nutrient dense as stuff that like our ancestors were eating, 70 years ago. Like, I think that this,
that makes you eat more too.
Yeah. Well, so this is actually, I was just going to say that. There's a really, really interesting book called The End of Craving. There's another one called
my sister read this, I think.
So good. So another one called Formerly Known as Food that I also...
What was it called?
Formerly Known as Food, that I highly recommend. That has a similar... has it like pointed to a study where basically they found that in animals, let's say like animals in a feedlot situation or whatever, they removed a key nutrient from the alfalfa and like grain sort of slurry that these animals were eating. And they found that when they removed this nutrient, animals ate more to try and make up in quantity what they were missing of this like key nutrient that they needed. I think that this is potentially a reason. This is pure conjecture on my part, but I think that this is potentially a reason and a mechanism that food manufacturers are using when they make ultra processed foods, where people like become so addicted because they're like, oh, this is missing a key nutrient somewhere in their body, mind, whatever. They're going, this food is missing a nutrient that I'm expecting, so I'm going to eat more of it to make up for the relative lack of this nutrient that sort of my like limbic brain is expecting to get by eating this thing. And I think that it's also probably a reason that, if you talk to many people that eat a lot of processed foods and are obese or overweight, there's always this like hunger loop going in their brain. It's a very common symptom. And my suspicion is that hunger loop is not related as much to many of the causes that people would say it is, but it's actually related to the body sort of craving and looking for a specific set of nutrients that are not present in many people's foods today.
Gosh, which really points back to, it's not just it's not just effort on people's part. Like how dare you not, whatever, you're not working out enough, you're blah blah. It's because people are actually hungry, or whatever it is, and you don't want to. No one wants to feel like they're starving themselves. I don't want to feel like I'm starving myself.
Yeah, I used to be so critical of people that were overweight or struggling with different like chronic diseases, and at some point in the last like 8 years, basically, I was just like, this is insane that I'm viewing people this way. It's like, obviously, when you're looking at population level increases of obesity rate going from 10 to 80% in the last like 70 years,
10 to 80%.
Yeah. Like this is just obviously not, there are not 8 times more people that like want to, be overweight and be struggling with their weight and things like this. This is so obviously an environmental problem, and a problem where, people like our sort of inclinations and animal instincts are being weaponized against us by these companies that are trying to make highly profitable, highly palatable, very addictive foodstuffs and making money doing so.
Man, that's crazy. You mentioned, just how long our food from being picked to us actually consuming it. And, I think the statistic is something like the average food or something like travels like 1,500 miles or something.
Yeah.
And, you guys at, for example, Kettle and Fire are very careful with your sourcing where you are getting your bones, whether it's beef bones and stuff. And you said, you're making sure grass-fed and regenerative farms, and they're probably doing rotational grazing and stuff. In your opinion, and have you thought about this at all? And, you talked about depleting soils and stuff. And I've heard this too, where there's, I don't know, like 30 more crop turnovers or something. I can't remember. Like, there's different estimates about the number of topsoil that is just so much. But are these more sustainable practices? Can they be scaled? Because, we know just doing monoculture, corn, soy, wheat, even if those things were good for you, which they're really not. But are there ways to grow our food and raise meat that could actually feed not only 330 million Americans, but, 7 billion people, however many people are on the planet now?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I also think that this argument, like, you have to zoom out. And what I like to ask some of these people, and they go like, oh, can you scale regenerative agriculture? I was like, let's zoom out. Does scale mean feed every American, but 80% of them have chronic illness? Like, do we consider that as like solving the problem of feeding everyone? Or does scale maybe mean, can we scale this problem? Will it take time? Yes. But I think that we can eventually, over the next 20 years, reach a system that feeds everyone using regenerative and regenerative like principles, and does so in a way that actually leads to happier, healthier, more productive, humans. Like in whenever someone says like, the food system of today is like a triumph of scale and engineering, I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, you just look around and the health outcomes are abysmal. Sure, we may be saving some money on a fertilizer, and like, sure, regenerative agriculture, especially the beginning during the transition period, may be more expensive. But I have to imagine that we would see massive savings on the back end as, our healthcare costs go down like 80 to 90% and the like. Like, one of the things that I think is lost in this sort of food system like regen scale argument is that, in my opinion, like, we basically are subsidizing our this sort of like monoculture, highly scaled, heavily chemically intensive fertilizer approach to producing our food, and we pay for it to the tune of like higher healthcare bill than we've ever seen before.
Trillions of dollars.
Yeah, totally. Like, yes, if you look at a food basis, the US spends less per human on producing our food than Europe. But our cost of healthcare is also like much, much, much larger than they pay in Europe. And I think those two things are integrally related, like are very, very tightly coupled. And I think that if you just look at like, can we scale regenerative principles from an economic standpoint and just compare that to our very broken current system, you miss the larger picture, which is like, if our goal is to scale healthier humans, I think that we can do that with a food system that is on net healthcare plus, agriculture, far less expensive than the healthcare plus agriculture industry and approach that we see today.
Makes a lot of sense. Have you looked into or have an opinion about hydroponics or aquaponics as part of a solution? Or would you say, I don't even know. Like, I'm so minimally exposed to it. I'm like, in my head, I'm going, I would assume it probably doesn't have the same nutrients, density, stuff like that. But I also get the benefits because you're like, it's a controlled environment in a greenhouse. You don't have to worry about pests. Maybe you can do it organic more easily because you're not having to spray pesticides and all that. Like, do you have a take on hydroponics, aquaponics?
This has been something that I've wanted to dig into more in the last year. I don't have a great take right now, but I think that my gut inclination is probably that there is a loss of nutrient density. Probably there's a lot of stuff that, like, zooming out, I would just say that they very, very rarely do you take something where you have this ecosystem, like plants are part of an ecosystem that, has many facets and many relationships between soil microbiome to the plant actually growing to sunshine to pests to like, and, any sorts of things. Very, very complicated, multifaceted web of relationships. Almost every time you see an ecology or an ecosystem get replaced by humans who like sort of come in with a blunt instrument and they're like, hey, we're just going to take this one part and we're going to bring in our own sunlight and we're going to like feed it X, Y, or Z, phosphorus, nitrogen, whatever. Very rarely have I seen that situation work out and not have any sort of second order consequences that it makes me skeptical, but that doesn't mean like, probably if your options are eating a organic hydroponic or aquaponic vegetables as opposed to like buying conventional from Walmart or whatever, probably it's better. But like, it's an area I really want to look into more.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me on its face, but I'm curious too. And maybe is it a step up from the other stuff? I don't know.
Totally.
If you've been enjoying the Building Culture podcast and are listening on Apple or Spotify, could you pause for just a moment and leave a 5-star review? My goal is to get to 100 reviews, and if you do, take a screenshot and email it to playbook@buildingculture.com. Playbook, PLAYBOOK @buildingculture.com. And when we hit 100, I'll randomly pick 5 winners and send them a Building Culture hat that looks just like this. I appreciate it. And back to the show. Yeah, you started the podcast talking about how you think health is one of the defining issues of our time, over the next 20 years. And I really believe that too, because I think the framework we both come from is in our businesses, how do you maximize human flourishing? How do you serve people and stuff like that? And, in my industry, we talk a lot about trade shortages and all sorts of things. And it's like, guys, building is hard. Being in a trade is hard. Whether it's a plumber, you're a framer or brick mason, you cannot do those things if you're not healthy.
Yeah.
And on top of that, just the social well-being and people being able to, you can't have a productive society. One, if you're spending 20% of GDP on healthcare, which is just going to keep going up. And then people also not being physically healthy to be able to do physical things and also mentally healthy. But the crazy thing is, it's like you just don't really hear. It's like climate change is the thing that's going to end the world and the apocalyptic stuff. And it's weird that we chose the thing that we can do the least about.
Yeah.
Versus if we were to just spend the money that we're kind of throwing at climate change for absolutely, minimal. And I'm not saying I'm very concerned about the environment, but I'm actually way more concerned about the environmental toxicity that we already have in our environment than climate change per se. Like that is going to get us, our health is going to get us so much faster than climate change. Like I'm curious, like how would you respond to that? Because that's a fairly controversial stance.
No, I totally agree. I mean, my skeptical take is oftentimes when you see a massive issue introduced that practically no one can actually do anything about, that oftentimes you'll see that issue being used as a way for some institution to grab more power. Like you're looking right now in the EU, and there's this idea of, I think in the UK, which I guess is not the EU, but I just saw this in the last week. They're introducing or considering introducing a climate tax that would allow them to sue and garnish wages and do all this sort of stuff because of the environment, because of X, Y, or Z. And you're like, we don't know. There's no mechanism by which we can put dollars towards X and climate change gets better. And so all of this is just a seizure or a way to seize power or get power from someone else right now, is my opinion. I also think that climate change it's this very it's so broad and the umbrella is so wide that it's extremely hard for anyone really to fight it or say that it's bad or whatever, which makes it a very powerful kind of meme. Basically the only bad guys in the climate change thing are oil and gas companies. I think that if you were to say, hey, why don't we get every American healthier and spend $100 million or $100 billion making this happen, you would have a whole
trillions of dollars. I mean, we spend trillions on climate change already,
totally.
and we're just getting started.
Yeah, but you would just have a whole host of special interests, big food companies, agriculture companies, healthcare companies, all of these groups that would all of a sudden be very, very angry and upset about what you're doing. So yeah, I think I would way rather we spend money on making humans healthy and reducing the environmental toxicity that we're seeing right now, which I think is honestly one and the same. But that's politics.
Well, kind of wrap up here, I kind of want to end with a little bit of continuation of this. And, in your most recent newsletter, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you said something on the lines of, I'm a capitalist. I've benefited from capitalism. I think it's an amazing system in a lot of ways. And that's would be my take too. It was kind of like reading, I'm like, yeah, that's about how I feel. But things are really broken right now within that. And you're like, I don't know what the answer is. And that's kind of where I'm at, because you mentioned at the beginning of this where you're talking about the government. And I'm like, in my job, I have to deal with the government actually a lot, both at the local level, the state level, and the federal level, because whether it's permitting or zoning or all the utilities or the inspections, the banking stuff is regulated, the financing stuff is regulated. And it's none of it is a very good experience. Yeah. And then you look at the FDA and all these other things and you're just going, okay, that handing more power to that system and all that doesn't seem like that's not my solution. That kind of is terrifying to me actually.
Yep.
But at the same time, I had serious concerns about these corporations and stuff. And, you mentioned, that's what it is. You mentioned the kind of the people that founded the companies are long gone. And they're CEOs, and it's kind of I think Mark Andreessen talks about this, the managerial, there's not really owners anymore. It's just managers of things. And no one really owns anything. I don't know. What's your kind of, what's your take on this? What are you thinking about right now in terms of what are solutions?
Oh man, I have no idea. I'm pretty early in thinking about this, but one of the things that I find interesting is that some of the companies that I think are doing some of the worst things in the US are, big food and pharma companies. And I just find it interesting that these companies are in many cases like over 100 years old. The CEO for Kellogg's, for example, the CEO owns like 0.1% of the company, like not enough where he can make any possible change and like force an agenda on it. And so even if that CEO really strongly believes that Kellogg's is like killing people and harming kids and whatever, he effectively can't really do anything about it. He doesn't own enough of the company. So like he doesn't really have control and ownership enough to make a change. And so when that happens, you basically have these massive corporations that are sort of run by shareholders, this like abstract, not like agentic, group of people. But you have this company that their goal and their explicit goal is just grow earnings per share, move up the stock price, and that is the only thing that they can basically optimize for. And I think that I don't know any solutions yet. This is just something that I've been thinking about, which is it's very strange to me that the companies in the country that I view as doing maybe the most harm to the US are ones where there's practically no single individual that has any control of these companies at all. That they're just these sort of like, to use like an AI person, an AGI or AI skeptic kind of phrase, they're like these paperclip maximizing entities where their goal is just make more profit, like no matter the expense of human health, well-being, anything like that. And I just think that's kind of weird. And I don't know what to think about it more than that.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. I don't have any answers, but it comes back to me a lot for that ownership and scale, because we see it in the building industry through institutional money. Like the way the world looks like it does, and there's multiple reasons, but one of them is it increasingly looks the way it does because of institutional money, centralized money that are investing, from a boardroom somewhere across the country in your neighborhood or my neighborhood. They don't care about your neighborhood. It's not that they're bad people per se, right? It's just like when you're at that scale and you're at that distance, how do you completely lose track of the idea that it's actually like humans, like human beings actually using these things or eating these things or whatever it is. It reminds me of, driving a car, and there's all sorts of studies that, how easy it is. Someone like cuts you off in a car and you're just like, like road rage is a real thing because you don't actually experience them as people. You see, you experience them as these moving vehicles, and it allows you to kind of dehumanize them. And I think when you get scale as big as a lot of these corporations are, some of that's happening. I remember reading a book. This was like 10 years ago, so I'm going to misquote some stuff. It was called Gangs of America, and it was about how the founding fathers of America were almost equally skeptical of giant corporations as they were of, kind of a unlimited government. And originally, like, corporations had almost no rights, and they couldn't even own assets outside of the very specific industry that they were in. Like the railroad company couldn't own, a manufacturing facility over here somewhere. And that over the past 200 something years, it wasn't legislative bodies, through Congress that, made the rights that they have now. It was actually all these just small Supreme Court decisions and precedent, kind of that over 200 something years, and suddenly corporations have more rights than human beings do, and you've got Citizens United and stuff like that, where, money is speech and all that, or I can't remember all that stuff. But that one is really sticks out in my mind of just like how corporations came to be and how concerned people early on were about the idea of like big faceless corporations just like this. Because I think the New East Indies Company did a lot of, inhuman stuff.
That stuff. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I basically think that it is maybe impossible, certainly very hard to give an institution power and, over time expect that institution will not at some point use its power for its own benefit and, against the benefit of other people. Like you see this in governments, you see this in corporations. And I think that basically governments and, big public companies are two of the most common instantiations of power. And like power can do some amazing things, and power can also do some horrible things. And like, I don't know. Yeah, I just don't know how to solve that problem. I'm like totally at a loss. This is like a new thing I'm just starting to think about.
Well, it's interesting because, I'm at a loss to accept, okay, it's like, okay, governments aren't going to save us. Of course, we both, I would think, I mean, I don't mean to speak on your behalf. Like, I believe in good regulations. Like, I want the environment and food systems better regulated, but like our hope can't be there or in giant corporations. And it kind of comes down back to, there's not anything going to come and save us. It's really about like human beings choosing, like individuals and stuff, choosing to do good. Like that is how you build a great society, is individuals, communities choosing to pursue good things, and that also means though that they might not, and living with the consequences of that. I don't know, because it's but I do have a lot of still hope for the future, frankly. Like what we started off at the early before we hopped on here was just, there are a lot of people working on these problems. There's a lot of people doing amazing things. And because we are an American, there's other countries too, but like we still have the ability to go build an amazing company and companies like you have, and solve these problems, which I think is just so exciting for me.
I totally agree. So I'm very hopeful, but we'll see what happens.
What are, just to close out, what are some of the things that you are kind of most excited about right now, whether it's companies or people out there doing things, what are some of the top things that are on your mind? But
let's see, things that I'm excited about. I'm really, honestly, I think that the things that would make the biggest difference, like in my view, that some of the things that would make the biggest difference in the US would be, or in the world would sort of be solving energy problems. I think that even like talking to the most doomer climate alarmist people, like everyone sort of recognizes that if we had what is the equivalent to free energy, like we could basically solve our climate problems or like make a huge dent in it. So I'm very bullish and interested on fusion stuff. The AI stuff I think is potentially scary, potentially really interesting and amazing. I don't totally know what to think about it, to be totally honest. And honestly, the thing that I'm most excited about is I feel like I'm seeing over and over again a resurgence and interest in local, decentralized sort of food systems and institutions that are actually going to compete against many of the very centralized sort of large institutions that I think are causing so much pain and wreaking so much havoc in our society today. And so that's something that I'm pretty bullish on, I would say.
That's cool. Well, Justin, thanks so much. Where can people find you, follow you, your newsletter?
Yeah, so I'm at, if they Google just Justin Mares Substack, I write a monthly newsletter called The Next. I'm also
I'll put that in the show notes.
I'm also on Twitter at JWMares, MARES. And yeah, that's probably the best place.
Cool. Well, Justin, appreciate it. And thanks so much also for what you're doing out there. We drink Kettle and Fire and enjoy the other products and stuff. So it's just awesome. And it was great to have you on, chat.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, man. This is really fun.
All right. Well, that was a really cool conversation with Justin. Gosh, there are some big challenges facing us today. But the exciting thing is we can do something about it. And I hope that you got some actionable information out of this, and I will put more resources in the show notes. If you like the Building Culture podcast, if you liked this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. And on Apple and Spotify, if you could leave us a 5-star review, it's really helpful. Thanks, and catch you next time.